House Republicans looking to subpoena members of the intelligence community as part of their investigation into how COVID-19 started. A report by GOP House members released this week found indications the virus may have been tied to China's bioweapons research program. That report accuses intel officials of publicly downplaying those potential links. Republicans are also expected to call Dr. Anthony Fauci to testify. You know, from the start of the coronavirus nightmare, Fauci dismissed the lab leak theory. Right after retiring from government for 50 years, he started saying that he has a completely open mind about the virus's origins. So we, as normally, don't know how he stands. Ben Domenech, Fox News contributor, editor-at-large of The Spectator. Ben, these investigations will be so critically important to know how things started. I've heard you and others say it. Why?
Well, I think a big part of what we want to know here is what the intel community was not telling us at the time, how they shaded the way that things were going. And I think that that's something that we definitely need to know. We've seen so many other aspects of the intelligence community in recent years be bad at their jobs and also not really be forthcoming to not just the American people, but to their elected representatives. And the gaps between what they were saying in public or to the committees that are offering oversight of them versus what they were saying internally is, I think, critically important for us to know. I also think that when it comes to Dr. Fauci, we know that there's so many different aspects of what he did during the course of this pandemic that we have serious questions about. You know, particularly, I'm concerned that he and others within the government colluded with major social media, big tech companies in order to censor speech that was being critical of their decisions, that was putting forward alternative visions of what we ought to be doing. And that's something that is absolutely horrendous if it turns out to be true. We have some early indications that could very well be the case. But I think ultimately what we need to be concerned about most here is, were all of these different people acting out of fear of what the Chinese government would do or could potentially do in terms of other areas of U.S. policy? Were they essentially running scared from the possibility that criticizing China could have ramifications in other different areas? If that was what was driving what was going on and what I think a lot of Americans suspect was going on, it raises a whole host of other questions about the priorities of these intel officials and whether they have American interests first in their minds.
Well, and are they willing to capitulate in other areas of our lives? You know, I mean, the pandemic may have exposed that. The idea that the intelligence community, though, is being looked at, real quickly, how surprised are you by that?
I'm not surprised. I think that there's been a number of people within or closely associated with members of Congress who have talked to me over the past several years about their rising concerns about whether the intel community was actually looking out for America's interests in so many different respects of policy. This is one more of them. And I think that what we shouldn't allow to have happen is for any kind of covering up things that make the Chinese effectively look bad. You know, they do such a good job, I think, of manipulating us in so many different respects. You remember that original meeting that happened early in the Biden administration in Alaska, where they weaponized sort of the language of BLM and around George Floyd and the like to call America, a nation that was engaged in prison camp behavior and things like that. It's all this kind of gaslighting designed to make people look away from China's terrible record when it comes to, not just the Uyghur citizens, but the treatment of their own citizens under the zero COVID policies. And I think that one of the things that we need to know going forward is, was the intel community really being honest with members of Congress about the evidence that we had about the potential lab leak hypothesis? We have to know that.
We have to know. The latest Hunter Biden headache for the White House: the president must now decide if he will, in fact, use an executive order to block the National Archives from releasing hundreds of Obama-era documents. Now, some of those docs included in that trove detail Hunter's business dealings with Ukrainian energy company Burisma. Those emails, due out in February, could shed light on just how closely President Biden was involved in Hunter's business dealings when he was VP. Fox News legal analyst Greg Jarrett.
You've got a criminal investigation by Biden's DOJ into Hunter Biden for corruption, influence peddling, fraud, money laundering, a variety of things, all of which documents suggest implicate Joe Biden. So if he tries to hide these documents by executive privilege, he has absolutely no legal basis to do so.
So is this anything like asking the coyote or the fox to watch the hens in the hen house?
It absolutely is that, Harris. But I also think that, one of the things that's at stake here is Joe Biden's reputation when it comes to all of these matters. He asserted to the American people throughout the campaign and from the debate stage that everything associated with raising these questions about Hunter Biden was laughable. He was dismissive. He said that there was no basis for any kind of questioning of this, that he had nothing to do with it, nothing untoward had happened. And of course, he also leaned into the now utterly debunked concept that this was in some way foreign meddling in American elections, that Hunter's laptop was inauthentic or the like, despite the fact that there were so many people, again, from America's Intel community who were making such a claim in support of Joe Biden at the time. Look, what's at stake here is if we're going to have any kind of transparency around what actually happened here and whether Hunter Biden behaved in ways that certainly, could bridge into illegality, but could be unethical. And we deserve to know that. We deserve to have that transparency.
If the president doesn't have a problem with any of this, why would he block the release, right? I mean, he says he wasn't a part of it. What would be a reason for blocking it? You can't really protect Hunter now because the media are not going to help you out in that. So many of them have had to admit that they, weren't right about that laptop thing. Now, I don't know if they weren't right or they were complicit in it. I don't know all of the facts of it, but they've had to come clean about that. So they can't then start a cover-up. All right, I have to let you go. I could go on for hours with you. Thank you so much. Merry Christmas to you, Megan and the babies, plural.
Merry Christmas to you, Harris, and to all your viewers and to your loved ones.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
You too.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.